My name is Geraldine. I'm a gratefully recovered, but definitely not cured compulsive overeater. And yeah, really, I suppose humbled to be asked to speak this morning and to share, my journey of recovery. So I suppose just a little bit of background. I've been in the program since late 2020, um, and at that stage, if I think about this disease, it was threefold. It is threefold. It was the physical, the mental, and the spiritual aspect. And it was obvious to everybody from looking at me physically that, I had all the signs of being powerless over food and, that my life was unmanageable as a result. Um, but, I just kept thinking I could do it myself. I just kept thinking I could do it myself. I didn't realize I was powerless over food. And, I knew there was something wrong. I was seeing a therapist who's basically 12 stepped me into this program, told me about OA, probably a year before I came to my first meeting in October 2020. I had admitted to her that I was addicted to food. So I knew that. I didn't have a huge problem with admitting that I was powerless over food, but it was still a bit of a shock when it came to it. I spent a year thinking about OA. Probably the COVID pandemic brought me to the rooms because I live rurally in Ireland. So I haven't even been to that many face-to-face meetings, just with family and work commitments. And I do remember, being quite frightened, because of my size and my high BMI, when the pandemic hit. And I remember, again, thinking I could do it myself, by giving up, some of the obvious items that I was addicted to. And as with every diet or whatever that I went on, all was grand for a couple of weeks. And then because of the discomfort of that, I was back in the food because at the time I didn't think this was anything but a physical and maybe a disease with some mental element. I had no idea of the spiritual element and therefore of the spiritual solution. I had been given the tools in the past, as in diets, to help with the physical aspect, but none of them treated the addiction. None of them acknowledged the fact that there were certain ingredients that I was completely powerless over. And, as the big book tells me, once I ingested them, I had no way of stopping. So I didn't realize there was that aspect. So that's why for me, the kind of diet aspect had stopped working. It had worked a few times when I was younger, because I didn't realize I had this disease. So when I came into the rooms, I can now see, the thread of my higher power, God, as I call that higher power, working, from very or very early on. I often share that, I phoned the number that was given for one of the meetings in Ireland. And the reason I phoned that number was because I thought my therapist had said to me, phone the number at that meeting. That person is very nice, and will be very welcoming. There's no way she said that. That was just a thought that my higher power planted in my head. I know now she has no links to that particular person or to that particular part of Ireland, and she and I have spoken about that. So I can see that from very early on, and that person became and still is my sponsor. And so I can see that higher power was taking care of me, even from those early days, that decision to come to a meeting. Um, and equally, I was 45 at the time, married, still married to the same person, with three children who at the time were 6 to 11, so they're a little bit older now. And they had me in their early years, very much in the food. And because of how, I was affected physically, there was lots of things I wasn't able to do with them. Like I share with people now, if one of them had needed me to crawl onto the floor to rescue them from something, I might have been able to get down. I wouldn't have been able to get up, because of my size. And I had developed arthritis as well, which, some of the things that I was eating, particularly the ingredients I was addicted to, are inflammatory and were really aggravating my disease. So, by putting them down, so it's true that, I was truly allergic, to them. So, it's the fact that I have found recovery in the physical sense obviously has been huge for them. But that's just one part of the story, and it's just one part of the recovery. For me, I suppose the enlightening part has been realizing that this disease isn't just about the physical or finding the right diet. It was nothing about that. I had to, I suppose what was different is once I identified my alcoholic foods and put them down, I realized that it has been easier for me to stay abstinent. And, I've thankfully been entirely abstinent since that date. And because volume was a huge issue for me, I have a weighed and measured food plan, which I'll be honest, I balked at. And I wondered on the 31st of October as I committed that plan to my sponsor what was going to be different. So what was different was the spiritual aspect of the program, recognizing that, you know, it wasn't the reason that I was eating wasn't because I didn't know what to eat, wasn't because I hadn't been given a nutritionally balanced program in the past, but it was because of life being unmanageable. And that's where I didn't have any problem with I'm addicted or I'm powerless over food, but my life is unmanageable. A part of me would have thought until I actually started working that step with my sponsor, well, my life was quite manageable. From the outside, all looks good. I had been very successful academically and in my career. But what I didn't realize is, that I couldn't manage that life without resorting to food. So if there was something uncomfortable at work, I would have lots of food. And I do remember, one of my direct reports remarking at one stage during a stressful day, gosh, you don't look stressed at all. You just keep it under control. But if you'd looked at the bin in my office, you'd have seen all the elements of, having not being really able to manage without having, a lot of my substance to see me through. And if I had substituted food for drugs or alcohol, like I would have been fired if I had been sitting there, drinking for the day. But, because it was food, it was more socially acceptable, and there was nothing in any company policy that was going to fire me for doing that. Um, and then there was probably a huge element of control. For me, the start of my spiritual awakening came when I started to read page 60 with my sponsor. So she took me through the steps using the big book and, just different podcasts from various different meetings that I listened to. And, also reaching out to fellows. But when we read page 60, and when I read the part about, you know, wanting to be the actor, or the actor who wants to run the show and wants to, deal with the lights, be the director, tell everybody where they needs to be and where they need to be. That really resonated with me. Then the penny dropped as to, my wanting, to be in control. And, when I think often about what steps, you know, were the ones that really helped me in recovery, this time last year, I came to realize that was step three, coming to believe, or making that decision to turn my will and my life over to the care of God as I understood Him. And that's the bit that every single day I have to work on. Like I said, I don't have any trouble admitting I'm powerless over food. I can see now in hindsight how my life was unmanageable without resorting to that food. But what's going to keep me sober and sane, and that's realizing that I'm not God. Whatever concept of a higher power I or any of us have, that for me, I just need to realize that's not God. And that every day or throughout the day, as I, struggle with some aspect of my life, whether it's at work, in family life, whatever, it's realizing I'm not in control. Even today, my husband and sons, are flying to the UK for to watch a sporting event, and they're at a hotel in the west of Ireland since last night, and it's windy. Now I live in the Cumber Mountains, so it's going to appear windier than what it is, and it's realizing that I need to hand that over. But in the past, I would have been eating on that. Um, so that's been a lot for me, the step three, making that decision. So stopping and pausing and saying, it's not up to me. Whatever is to happen today, that's in God's hands. And in order to truly do that handover, I have to look back to the step that came before it, which is step two. And that's the coming to believe that a power greater than myself can restore me to sanity. So, in order to believe I can be restored to sanity, I have to accept that I'm insane. And I have insane thoughts. And absolutely, I do. And even yesterday, when I was sharing my step 10, my fear with my step 10 partner, there was a fear there. And a lot of things had gone right for me yesterday. My children had a couple of sporting events that went right. And immediately I went into fear, to fear that today wouldn't go right. Firstly, that, because I had to collect my daughter late last night, that somehow I would oversleep, even though I haven't done that in years. Um, and equally, that somehow something would happen today. And as I spoke to my husband, I was like, what if the flight doesn't go? What if it gets too windy? And he said, and that will be it. If it does, it does. And that's the acceptance. Acceptance is definitely the answer. And it's very much handing over to God. And as I spoke to the person I was sharing the step 10 with, she shared with me that she had seen one day, like a little sign in a shop that said, what if everything goes well today? Um, and I just thought, yeah, that's possible that everything will go well. So how about I just say to my higher power, to God, yeah, you take this, you take today, and let me just read the script, read the lines, and let me stop doing, as is described on page 60, that I'm the one writing the script for everyone. Because definitely that's when the insanity creeps in. When I decide to take the pen of the script back from God and say, I know better, I've got a plan for today, and let me tell you how I'd like it to be and how it should be. And here's all the lines the various different people are to read, and this is how it's to go. And what usually happens, the show doesn't come off. I get very irritated. And, back in 2020 and beyond, I resorted to the food. And when I can see that clearly, and that was it. That was it throughout the day. The spiritual malady was the one that was running the show for me. So thankfully today I can see that. It's not to say that at times my head doesn't go to the part where I say, let me run the show. Um, but I pause and I say, what do you do now there, Geraldine? You're trying to be God. You're letting the insane thoughts come to mind. And there can be a lot of discomfort there and there can be a lot of uncertainty. But when I stop and pause, and it's just a case of stopping up, whether it's in my working day or at home and, using the tools of the program, so by working through the steps, reading the big book with my sponsor, and, going to meetings and talking to fellows, that has given me, I suppose, a way of living so that when these thoughts come up, because life still becomes lifey, there's still times when I go, oh gosh, I have to do this or I have to do that. But when I stop and pause in the middle of my working day, I was amazed very early on in the program. I had a technical issue. I work in finance and I didn't know what to do. And I stopped and I paused and I asked God, and He actually gave me the answer in a very technical financial way. And I just smiled and I thought, I didn't realize that God actually has all the answers. A part of my ego thought that I might be better than God at some of these things. And when He said to me, how about you do this and you do that? And I just thought, when I stop and pause, I get that way forward. I get the answers. And I was amazed. And just seeing that in early recovery, it really helped me. When I was doing my step 4, my husband's appendix ruptured. He was hospitalized. I was at home with 3 small children, COVID, so, couldn't get a lot of outside help and, 3 children to deal with. And it worked out fine. And that was God telling me that I could work this program even without having somebody in the background taking away all of the or a lot of the outside pressures doing the bedtimes so I could get to meetings. And I realized if I could do my step 4, while he was in hospital, with an element of worry, and dealing with the children, it actually gave me peace and quiet at night time to sit down and write. So from very early on, I had spiritual experiences throughout that time between, my grandmother who is deceased, getting that sense of her being with me. Um, and then as I moved through the program, my father was alive at the time and he had Parkinson's and Lewy body dementia. And I could see how the program really helped me, through his final months and years, to get to that point. So for me today, recovery looks like getting up in the morning, doing that step 11, stopping and praying and reminding myself, that God is there and with me from very in the early in the morning. So I'll pass with that. And yeah, so thanks everyone for listening.